Hi, everyone. Looks like we are live. So welcome. I'm so happy to have everybody joining us tonight. I've been sitting here with Geoff and Crystal, and we have been watching the numbers climb. So just about 5 minutes ago, I think there were 15 people, and now we're up to 40. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. So we are so excited to be here and to welcome you to the launch of Geoff Mynett's Pinkerton and the Hunt for Simon Gunanoot, Double Murder, Secret Agents, and an Elusive Outlaw. My name is Malaika Aleba, and I am the new Marketing and Promotions Coordinator for Caitlin Press. So it's really nice to meet everyone virtually. A little bit about Caitlin Press. So as you know, Caitlin Press is an independent Canadian publisher, and we're located on the Sunshine Coast in British Columbia. We publish culturally significant books, including fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Caitlin Press is also the home of Dagger Editions, which is an imprint for the voices of queer women identifying writers. So I have a few thanks that I'd like to give before we start. I would like to acknowledge the support that Caitlin Press receives from the Government of Canada and the British Columbia Arts Council through the Canada Book Fund as a small independent publisher. As everyone knows, during these times with COVID, the funding is very, very much appreciated. And then I would also like to give a big thanks to Book Warehouse in Vancouver, where you can purchase limited, they're going really, really quickly, limited signed copies of Geoff's book. So there's the little green button at the bottom of the screen where you should be able to click and then purchase books. And then, of course, you can also purchase books directly from the Caitlin Press website. So that's always there as well. Although this event is virtual, of course, it does take place on the land of Indigenous peoples. And so we'd like to recognize that Caitlin Press is located in Half Moon Bay on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Sechelt, and Slilaman First Nations. I work remotely actually from Montreal all the way on the East Coast, which is on the traditional unceded territories of the Ganeanan-Gahe. Crystal lives in Pinkerton, which is the traditional territory of the Syilx First Nation, and Geoff lives in Vancouver, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Where are you joining us from? Let us know in the chat. Before we begin, a few short housekeeping things. So the audience video and mic are not active. So that means that if you want to ask a question, just pop it up in the chat. We are recording and it will be available on YouTube after the event. And although all other users can see the chat is actually not recorded to YouTube. If you would like to hide the chat and just focus on the event, if you're on a desktop computer, you can just put your mic in the upper right-hand corner of the chat and a little down arrow will pop up. So you just click on that and it will hide the chat. If you would like to ask questions, you can just click the little Ask a Question button down below on your desktop computer, or you can ask in the chat and we'll make sure that they're tagged as questions. So if you see somebody's question and you think, that's a really, really good question, love that question, you can actually just upvote it, and then we'll see that it's a really, really popular question, and we'll make sure to ask it to Geoff. And of course, again, I encourage everybody to buy the book, click on the little green button, and support the Book Warehouse in Vancouver. And then if you want to also look for your local bookstore, but you can't find it, then you can just ask in the chat and we will try to locate one for you. Now I'm going to get into some more information about Geoff and also about Crystal. So Geoff, as many of you know, was born in England. He arrived in British Columbia in 1973 and practiced as a lawyer until his retirement in 2000. At the end of 2019, he published his first book, Service on the Skeena, and it was a BC bestseller for almost an entire dozen weeks. Pinkertons and the Hunt for Simon Gunanoot is his second book. Released recently, a few weeks ago on March 12th, it has already spent 3 weeks on the bestseller list. So it has been a bestseller essentially since it was published. So huge congratulations to Geoff. And we have recently announced that we will be publishing his third book, Murders on the Skeena, True Crime in the Old Canadian West, and it's coming in autumn of 2021. So be on the lookout because we're going to have another great book launch then. Maybe, fingers crossed, this one in person. Now I'll present Crystal. So Crystal is the business partner of Geoff and the business partner, of Geoff's daughter-in-law, Annika. And she loves true crime and has been excited for the launch of Pinkertons and the Hunt for Simon Gunanoot. She has a special connection to Hazelton as her father-in-law was a physician in residence at Rynch Memorial Hospital, which was founded by Horace Rynch, the main character and focal point of Geoff's first book, Service on the Skeena. And yeah, Crystal and Geoff are really, really excited to talk to everybody. And so take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to get a chance to talk to Geoff. We haven't seen each other in person since pre-COVID times. So it's really exciting to get to the chance to have this longer conversation with you. So I guess I really want to start with finding out what made this book, this story, the next one on your list.
Well, thanks, Crystal. It's nice to see you again. First, before we do that, I want to thank Caitlin Press for publishing this book, and also my family for their support in it. I also want to recognize Peter Newbury up in Hazelton for his championship and support through the last number of years. And also Neil Sturridge, who really encouraged me to write this book. And Neil who for many years was the president of Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en Tribal Council. So I just wanted to make acknowledgement of their contribution to this book. So the book, it's a book about one of the most famous outlaws in British Columbia's history, Simon Gunanoot. And for those people in the north who know about him, I apologize, I'm telling you something you already know, but down here in Vancouver, he's not so well known. So what happened? What's the book about? Well, June the 19th, 1906, he went into a bar at a hamlet just outside Hazelton in the north and got into a fight after some drinks with a man named Alex McIntosh. McIntosh bested him in a fight, and Gunanoot left the bar, swearing to come back with a gun and fix him. When McIntosh's body was found on the trail the next morning, the police at once concluded that it must have been Simon Gunanoot. So they went back to get, there's only one policeman in town, they went back to get a posse together, and then they were told that another body had been found on the trail to Simon Gunanoot's ranch. And this is the body of a man called Max Leclerc. And this started the drama of Simon Gunanoot. The police posse went to his farm to search for him, but he had escaped. And he spent 13 years in the wilderness of northern British Columbia, evading all attempts by the police to find him. Now, the police sent party after party after party trying to find him in the wilderness. They all failed. They then turned to Pinkerton's National Detective Agency and asked the two special operatives to go up, disguised as prospectors, to find him. They spent a year in and around Hazelton and the north, talking to everyone, looking for Simon Gunanoot, going out on the trail, and at least twice a week, they sent back written reports to Seattle. And it's these reports, which have been in the BC archives ever since, that I have based the book on. So the story is really based on their reports of the 1 year they were searching for Simon Gunanoot in the north in 1909 to 1910. Crystal.
Yeah, I mean, so apologies, I guess, again, for those who are from the north who are joining us, but for us Southerners, could you kind of paint us a bit more of a picture of what the North was like at that time? You know, what was what's the scene there? Where is Hazelton? How large is it? What's it like there in the early 1900s? Could you give us a little bit more detail?
Yeah, it's very remote. Hazelton is located where two rivers join, the Skeena and the Bulkley. And it achieved its prominence when steamers managed to get up the river to Hazelton in 1891. And it was really the jumping off point for goods being sent on to the miners in the Ominica mines, the creeks and streams, to the telegraph operators, and for the increasing number of settlers. It was an old west town. There were no roads, no railway until 1913. Horses are the way you got around, and mules. And goods were brought up river, and it's a very difficult river, to Hazelton and taken on into the hinterland. Now, the river was closed for 6 months of every year by ice and bad weather. So if you didn't get your supplies in by October, you had to wait till May, in effect. So it is very isolated, very remote. In 1900, only about 40 non-Indigenous people there lived there. And even by 1909, there were only about 130. And we know that because the new chief of police in 1909 did a head count so he could increase the license tax on the local bars. In 1906, there were about 60 or 70 people living there, and they had 3 bars. So it is quite a drinking town as well. Mm. It was rough. It was the headquarters of the mule pack trains. It was the real Old West.
So you're telling us then that there are undercover operatives from the south, like from Seattle, going into this very remote wilderness where supplies can only happen for half of the year. Okay, you're gonna have to share the rest of the characters in this story who are operating in this Wild West, including the Pinkertons.
Well, the two Pinkertons people, we only know the name of one because Pinkertons were very, very secretive about their agents, and they gave them numbers. And it's quite a piece of detective work to put together a clue here, a clue there, to find out who in fact the name of one of them was, Mynett, because I know what date he arrived in Hazelton, and the local newspapers show who arrived on that date. And I have initials from another letter, WTB, that give me the clues that his name was W.T. Bennett. His partner only goes by the name of Number 6. Now, I have to presume that they were chosen for this job because they knew how to live in the wilds of the north. And we do know that Bennett had been up in Atlin a few years before. So those are the two main characters who were out looking for Simon Gunanoot. Now, Simon Gunanoot went out into the wilderness with his family, his brother-in-law, Peter Hamadan, who in fact was also accused of the murders for no good reason, but there's a party of about 11 or 12, 13 people who were out in the wilds being hunted by the police and by the operatives. And they went into Hazelton and talked in the bars, and they talked to the policemen, and they talked to the missionaries. And it's all quite interesting. One of the reasons I like this story is the nuance in it. You never quite know who's telling the truth, who's on Gunanoot's side, who is misleading them, and what the missionary in Kistiaks was doing, and how much you trusted this chap. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. And that's part of the fascination for me. A lot of questions, a lot of nuance, which for me made it a fascinating story.
I would love to get just a little bit deeper into the research that went into this. There must have been reams and reams and reams of things. So could you just share a little bit more about that process and how you got to distill all of this information from those sources?
Well, first I should confess or acknowledge I love research. I love going into the old papers, and especially the original papers. So I enjoy doing research in the archives. And when I was doing research for my first book in the BC archives, I went down numerous rabbit holes that came up in front of me. And And the one to do with the Pinkertons I was very interested in, because Horace Wrench had a lot to do with Gunanoot. In fact, Gunanoot's body was found on his own personal land, and he was the first on the scene. So that led me deeper into the papers, the reports, which are scattered through a number of files and microfilm. And then, of course, the old newspapers are fascinating because they give you the real sense of the drama at the time and what people were saying at the time. And the numerous other letters from the policeman in town to the policeman in Victoria. And then a new policeman came up in 1909 called James Maitland-Dougal, who was an efficient character who came with 3 or 4 other policemen to bring some law and order into this rowdy town. And he wrote a diary, day-by-day diary of his time in Hazelton. That gave me a lot of colour and a lot of background information about Hazelton as well. So it's really, as I got more and more into the papers, and more into the archives, it really fleshed out what was a fascinating story.
Can you pick out a few things from that research that you did, things that surprised you, things that fascinated you, things that wowed you?
I was not prepared for the amount of assistance that the white settlers gave to Simon Gunanoot. There were no good guys, bad guys in the story. Everyone's got a rounded situation. For example, I don't want to give too much away, but Gunanoot survived in the wilderness by trapping and hunting, and he sold his furs to middlemen who sold them in the Hudson's Bay Company in Hazelton. And the Hudson's Bay Company people in Hazelton knew perfectly well where the furs were coming from and knew perfectly well who the middleman was. And in fact, one of the middlemen used to meet middlemen, a chap called George Burns, used to meet Gunanoot up on the trails and take the furs from him, sell them for a good price in Hazelton, and then either buy his supplies or take him the money and take the supplies out to meet him on the trail. And George Burns played a big part in fact, the surrender of Gunanoot in 1919, 13 years later. So that's one example of the nuance in the situation.
I love that you called the characters that you said rounded. And as I was reading the book, I kept thinking, geez, all these characters could have their own books. They could have their own plots and their whole own adventures. I'm curious if you want to introduce any other characters that you found particularly interesting.
Well, there's a missionary at Kispiox called William Pierce, who was himself half Tsimshian, and he played a rather equivocal role because the missionary is not well thought of in Hazelton. They were thought to be too interfering, and Pierce was thought to have been a go-between, one of the go-betweens between Gunanoot and people in Hazelton. And I think the rumor got around that if you wanted to get a message to Gunanoot, you gave it to William Pierce and it would find its way there. And in fact, Pierce, Gunanoots had family in Kispiox, so he used to visit them. And it was quite frustrating for James Maitland-Dougal, the police chief in Hazelton, to learn when Gunanoot had been in town or had been seen on the trail, or he was always told this after the event. No one ever told him before the event, and that was no coincidence, I'm sure. There's one time when he thought he'd made a friend of one particular Gitxsan man who was going to tell him when Gunanoot was in town, but he always told him afterwards. But one time Gunanoot was in town with a bit too much to drink, walking down the main street, and no one told the police, or no one told anyone, but everyone knew who he was. And there's another story that one time when the first movies were being shown in Hazelton in 1913, 14, thereabouts, that Gunanoot really wanted to see one of these. So he bought a new suit, new tie, and he looked pretty dapper. And I think you can see from the cover of the book that he could look pretty dapper when he wanted to be. And he came in and sat in at the back. And those people who knew who he was didn't say anything. And some people who wondered who this cool-looking dude was, but they didn't know. So he came into town more and more during his First World War, but no one gave him away. No one ever gave him away, even though there's a big reward on his head.
How come? So there's like two questions that come up. How come nobody wanted the reward? How come no one gave him away? And the second one, how come Gunanoot, what do you think he was so good at doing this? Like, what was he doing out on the lam? How did he get back into town? Like, what are your impressions? What do you think happened there?
Well, Gunanoot was a merchant. He was very good at figures. He was doing very well. He was very well liked and very well respected. The person he shot, Alex McIntosh, to put it charitably, was a thug. He had a bad reputation. He was enormously strong. He worked on the steamers and he worked on the pack trains. To give you an idea of his character, he once had a fight with a man, and they made up afterwards and went to shake hands. And when they went to shake hands, Gunanoot brought his other hand from behind his back with a rock in and hit the man around the head. So he was not well liked. And frankly, most people thought he had it coming. So there's a lot of support for Gunanoot. And people didn't want to give him away. No one wanted to give him away, even though there's a big reward for him. And even though some of the Kazan may have been tempted, none did. So he was liked, he was popular. People thought it was, it would have been wrong to bring him under arrest into town. He lived on the, when he was out in the wilderness, he was a great traveler. He was a huge traveler, traveled fast. He went up to the Yukon border. He's one of those people you saw at Babine Lake one day, and 2 days later he was up 150 miles north somewhere else. Whenever any of the police got anywhere near, by the time they got to where he was 200 miles away. He was a fast traveler, and he lived off trapping and hunting and selling his furs. And he was a backwoodsman. He knew what he was doing.
So one, must have been really frustrating for the Pinkertons men to try to catch somebody who's able to do this.
Yep.
And two, it really feels like I don't understand why did the BC government, why did the police in Victoria, why did they want to catch him so bad?
This is one of the big questions about the whole case. And I think the police on the ground in Hazelton knew it was hopeless. And they several times tried to say, look, we're not going to catch this guy. He's out in the wilderness. He knows what he's doing. He sees us coming. He's got too many friends. People tell him we're coming. But the people in Victoria persisted. So why? We don't have a definite answer. My belief and my thought is that this is all to do with the relations between the Indigenous peoples of the area and the government in Victoria. Up until 1900, and I'm not an expert in Indigenous matters, so I have to bear that in mind. Up to 1900, the relations were fairly good. There were hot spots, but basically they were fairly good. The white settlers were very much a minority. They intermarried with the Gitxsan. They spoke their languages. They knew their customs, and they got on. After 1900, everything changed, as far as I can see. Government came. You had the first policeman arriving in 1900. You had the telegraph arriving in 1900, telegraph operators. You had the doctor in the hospital. And even though, yes, it brought help to people, it was disruption to Gitxsan ways and spiritual ways of healing. And you had fishery officers coming in to change fishery regulations and enforcing them. Gitxsan grievances mounted often very justifiable grievances. People came onto their land with pieces of paper issued in Victoria saying they had a right to it and putting up fences. So some of them were getting pretty annoyed. There was pushback. Some people were defying the law. Some of the Git Kazan were pushing some of the white people off their land and not allowing them onto their land. I think the government in Victoria saw this threat as a threat to their authority, and they saw they had to prove their authority by arresting Gunanoot. And I think they pushed on, even though really they had been warned or told it wasn't going to work. They pushed on year after year after year after year to try and prove the supremacy of colonial law. That's my take. I may be wrong, but that's my take.
I do feel like you can kind of sense some of that in even the reports and that relentlessness. Like reading it made me really frustrated. Reading like Pinkerton's attempts and failures, which felt like over and over again. And I just kept wondering, why would they keep pursuing it? So perhaps you've got something there with how you're identifying it.
That's how I see it. I mean, both chief policeman in Hazelton wrote saying at the beginning of September, wrote to the chief of police in Victoria saying, if we send these guys out this winter, it's going to be one hell of a ride. This is bad country in winter, deep snow. They might not get him. Do you really want to go on and do this? And the word came back, yes, we've got to do it. At that point, one of the two Pinkertons men said, I'm not going. I'm going home, mate. So number 6, we never know his name, number 6 went back to Seattle. And the Bennett, the one Pinkertons man left, hired a local man called Huey McKay to go with him into the wilderness. And they spent an extremely frustrating winter, floundering around in snow and ice, not getting anywhere. And I think they must themselves have realized this is pointless. And at one point, I think their morale just broke. And they said, we're coming back. We can't do it.
It even in the reports and in the story that you tell around the reports, there's a lot of that, like, why would they keep trying? So, would you say that, okay, so in the reports, it never really sounds like pressure from some outside force. It's only reading the other information that it seems like pressure. Do you feel like the Pinkerton men felt like it was a lot of pressure when they were in the woods?
I think they were doing a job, and they were professionals. They've often been laughed at and said, "Well, how could Pinkerton's men do this job? They were just idiots." I think there's a bit of that impression left still about them. I think they were hired to do a job, and they were going to do it. They were, they might not have thought it was possible, but that's what they were paid for. Pinkertons, if I might step back a moment, Pinkerton's National Detective Agency was set up in the 1850s by Alan Pinkerton. And before the First World War, it was perhaps the most respected detective agency in the world. And it was respected because it cut across national and international boundaries. The Scotland Yard used them. The Sûreté in Paris used them. They knew criminals, and they kept files on criminals. They kept mugshots on file, and they kept, in the day before it became how it was done, they kept detailed records on different criminals, how they worked, what their modus operandi was. It was a professional organization. They have another reputation, which is a strike breaking and union busting, and that is also true. So they've really got this twofold reputation. One of being detectives and good detectives, the other of being strike breakers.
I'm hoping that answers. I'm just seeing that there was a question here about why the government went to America to find the detectives, the Pinkertons. I'm hoping that Bob and Linda's questions getting answered here.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the British Columbia Police did not have a detective service at the time. It had a police force, a limited number of people, only about 200 members of the BC Provincial Police. Vancouver had its police force, Victoria had its police force, but it did not, it had a limited number of policemen and no detective force. When detectives or anything undercover was needed in the province, the police went to Pinkerton's detective agency for help. They were used, for example, in hunting Billy Miner, the train robber. That is one of the other manhunts they were on. So they were used in a number of cases around the province where we would normally think detectives should be. And clearly, they had to go in disguise as prospectors because if anyone knew who they were, the game was up. So they couldn't go as policemen. They had to go disguised.
Do you think that they were good? Like, I'm just wondering, you talked about Gunanoot having like all of his friends and acquaintances helping him. So I'm just wondering, do you think that everyone just played along with the Pinkertons, or they all knew, or do you think they were actually really good?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that for a while, their identity was kept secret. And even when they left town in May of 1910, no one knew who they were, or it was not known generally who they were. However, and I'm speculating here because we don't know, and one shouldn't speculate, but hey, it's fun at times. However, they were sending reports back by mail twice a week to Seattle. How many prospectors will be doing that?
Good question.
And I've got to think that Richard Sargent, who was one of the merchants in town and the postmaster, must have suspected. And he was a wily cove, and he probably bought furs from Pinkerton, from Gunanoot, knowing who they were from. I have to wonder if, in fact, some people did suspect. Not necessarily that they were Pinkertons, but that they were not what they seemed to be. Do I have any evidence for that? No. Do I suspect it? Yes. But we don't know. I have searched as carefully as I can newspapers to see when it was first acknowledged that Pinkerton's agents had been in Hazelton looking for Gunanoot at that time. The first reference I can find is in the 1950s. Exactly. You would have think that if it had become known generally beforehand, there would have been some mention in the articles in the 1920s and 1930s, around the time of the trial, perhaps, that the Pinkertons men had been on the job. I couldn't find anything.
Was it brought up in the trial?
No, not Pinkerton, not at all. Now, the first reference, the first time I can join the pieces of string between Pinkertons and Gunanoot was in the 50s. I may have missed some reference somewhere, but you know, there are a lot of articles written about Gunanoot in the 1920s and 1930s. None of them that I can see referenced Pinkertons being on the job. So this is one of the reasons this is such a fascinating story. There's so many questions, a lot of which are still unanswered.
Yeah. Well, now I'm curious. If it wasn't referenced until the 1950s, did you not know about the Pinkertons until you went searching about the story of Gunanoot?
I first heard of the story of Gunanoot in about 1980. So I've known the story for a long time. And I was told the story by a mountain RCMP officer who was stationed in Hazelton in the early 30s when Gunanoot in fact died. So he told me the story, 1979, 1980. So I've known the story, and I've known the Pinkertons were involved since then. But I really didn't know the details until I got into reading the reports when I was doing research for service on the Skeena. And then it really started fleshing out into a fascinating story of I'd like to, should I say futility? Maybe I should, because when all is said and done, you've got to ask yourself the question, did they ever have any chance of catching him? I don't know.
Yeah, so why do you think, I mean, if there was no chance in catching him and he seemed like he was coming into town all the time anyway, why'd he turn himself in?
I think he got tired of living in the wilderness. He wanted his children to have an education. And I think he thought or was persuaded that all the evidence and all the witnesses were long gone. And even if he was tried, he wouldn't be found guilty. Now, the trial itself is interesting.
Yeah, I'm like, go on. That's going to be my next question. Talk about the trial.
The trial is interesting because a lot of evidence was available. A lot of witnesses were available. Some of the evidence that might be thought to be damning or might be thought to be very persuasive, which was just not used at the trial. There were statements made in 1906, 1907 in writing that we know were in the police files in Victoria that were not produced at trial. I don't know. The jury took 13 minutes to make their minds up. By then, Gunanoot was a bit of a hero. The noble outlaw, Robin Hood of the North, and everyone was very happy he got acquitted.
Everyone?
I don't know about Macintosh's family, but I think most people were pretty happy he got acquitted. He was quite popular.
So to the people, I hear that, but then we just learned from you that, you know, the government was really adamant that we catch Gunanoot. So
yeah, the government's changed. Between the time when they were ardent to catch him and persistent in trying to find him, and 1919, when he gave himself up, there's a world war. Everything changed in the war. And everything that happened pre-war became, the past. And I think the government that was so determined to convict him before the war might well have thought after the war that this is going to be more trouble than it's worth. We can't, he's so popular. If he was convicted of a capital crime and hanged, that would be really, really troublesome. So I don't know. That's one of the many, many unanswered questions and fascinating questions. Could he have been found guilty, or was the trial not pursued as hard as it might have been? Certainly, some witnesses were brought forth who could have been very damaging. One of them who had met Gunanoot just after the murders, before he knew about the murders, and had heard Gunanoot talk about having killed these people. His written statement was not used, and he was a bad witness in court. So it's a fascinating trial. And everyone was very happy he got acquitted.
I know there's questions that I think are coming in, and I want to encourage people to also ask questions. Here's one from Michael. Given that the other biography of Gunanoot was written by David Williams, also a lawyer, what is it about Gunanoot's story that fascinates you lawyers?
Interesting enough, I met David Williams when he was writing the Gunanoot book in about 1980 in the archives in Victoria. I'm not sure what it is about that appeals necessarily to lawyers, because I don't think it's primarily a matter of law. is primarily a matter of history and fascinating history of the North. And it is a fascinating area up there. And I haven't spoken all that much about Hazelton, but it's a beautiful area, lovely people there, and lovely small town. And it just has that special feeling about it that certainly attracts me. And we've been back there numerous times. His book deals with the whole Gunanoot story from the whole Gunanoot's life. So his is a different book in a sense. It's a very good book, but it's the whole story from Gunanoot growing up and what happened to him before and the time he spent on the lam when he was in the wilderness and the time afterwards. So his has a slightly different focus. But it's a fascinating story, and I can see I can very much share his fascination with it. But I don't think it's anything to do with being a lawyer.
I'm like, I'm not a lawyer. I'm fascinated too. I hope others listening in are also as fascinated too. Geoff, give me a sec here. I'm just going to look at the other questions that are coming in. At the time, okay, so at that time, was it only being found innocent? Was it only being found innocent or being hanged? No manslaughter that might have helped balance his popularity with presumed guilt, especially with all the evidence. Thoughts there?
I think it would have been a capital offence. I think he could well have been hanged. Whether he would have been reprieved, I don't know. Consider what happened. There's no, it wasn't an accident. He was in a bar in a little place outside Hazelton called 2 Mile, and he left the bar furious and having been bested in a fight. He rode over an hour back to his farm, collected a gun, rode back to the trail, and there shot not just one person, but 2 people. It's hard to argue that that was anything but murder. I don't think there would have been a case for manslaughter there at all. That was murder. He wasn't. It's a good question how drunk he was. He certainly had been drinking, but he wasn't rolling drunk. Certainly not enough to give him a defense against a murder charge. After all, he rode back an hour to his farm, collected guns, rode back to the trail, met the murder victim, shot him with deadly accuracy, and then not long after shot a second man with deadly accuracy in almost exactly the same place. He was not drunk. That would not have been a defense to him. He deliberately went back, got a gun, shot this man. I think that would have been capital murder.
You mentioned he was drunk. Am I correct or incorrect in that there were some discrepancies in that story, part of the story as well? Was there a story that he was just selling salmon or selling something there? He just dropped in? Or did I get that part? It's from another story. So many characters, Geoff.
He went from his farm to buy some fish, some salmon. And on his way back, he stopped and went into the bar at a place called 2 Mile, which is 2 miles outside Hazelton. And there he had some drinks. How much is not clear, but he got into a fight with the murder victim, and he was bested in the fight, and he left, and he'd had some drinks, but I wouldn't say he was drunk. But that's, one can wonder about that. He certainly had some drinks, but he rode back, and 2 hours later he's on the trail and he shot 2 men dead exactly where he wanted to shoot them. He was not drunk, but he'd had some drinking. He'd had some drink in him. So it'd be very hard to say that was an accident.
Yeah. And there's no breathalyzers then, so.
No breathalyzers. Not for a horse, no.
Monica's asking, which chapter or section was the most interesting to you to write or to research?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that the 7 days after the murder, because I had to slide over it a little bit because a lot happened in those 7 days. There's one policeman in town, a man called Kirby, and he summoned a posse to a good old-fashioned posse, horses and men on horseback galloping out of town to find the outlaw. It really was the Old West. And he went to Gunanoot's farm and posted. Kirby had been a military man in India, and he knew all about how to attack a place. So he sent some people around on the other side of the farm, Gunanoot's farm, while he came in from one side. And he came in on the farm and found that someone had killed Gunanoot's horses. 3 of them were shot dead. One was killed with an axe, I think. Gunanoot wasn't there, but had been there not long before. He then saw someone walking on the riverbank, and he said to one of his people in the posse, "Hey, isn't that him?" And the person he was with said, no, just looks like him. And it turns out that some members of his posse had deliberately allowed Gunanoot to escape and to go down on the riverbank and get away. Mm. And that first week, it shows how Kirby was trying quite well to search for Gunanoot. And he went out every night with people to search a place or put a trap for him. He's been much maligned over the years for being negligent. I don't think that's right. I think he's almost caught him a number of times during that first week. And at the end of the first week, for some reason, he was taken off the job, and someone else was put on the job instead who bungled it completely. And Gunanoot got away, clear away, and was away for 13 years. So the chapter, that first week after the murder, I think was fascinating to piece together.
For true crime addicts like myself, that's the time where like the most evidence is collected and the most things could possibly happen. So yes. I love that is true in this case too.
Yes.
Somebody asked, thinking about so Kirby didn't catch him, but was close. What's the closest that the Pinkertons got to capturing him? Did they ever get close?
I don't think so. There were some close calls. And I think Pinkertons were led on some wild goose chases. They were in the area, but I don't think they were close. Partly because I think that Gunanoot saw them coming. I don't think, and I think the Pinkertons men knew, certainly in the winter, that this is getting to be a hopeless case. And they were there because it was their job, not because they thought they were going to catch him. And they gave up hope themselves in the late winter of 2010. So I don't think they got that close to him. Other people did. There's one case where in Kisviox, which is a small town where Gunanoot came from, 9-10 miles from Hazelton, where Gunanoot, before the trouble, had been a shareholder in the sawmill. And in about 1911-ish, there's a bit of a profit to the sawmill, which is being run by the local missionary for the First Nations people there, the Pinkerton people there. So Gunanoot came in to collect his share of the profits. And the missionary said, Reverend Lee said, I don't have it for you now, but come back later. Come back this evening, and I'll give it to you. And so Gunanoot said, okay. And when Gunanoot had gone, Reverend Lee got on his horse and rode over to see Dr. Rynch. at the Hazelton Hospital and said, well, what do I do? This chap's coming to see me. And I know he's Gunanoot, although he says he may not be. What do I do? Do I tell the police or what? And Dr. Rinch and Reverend Lee, and Dr. Rinch is also a clergyman, they talked about it for a while. And finally, Rinch said, no, that if we tell the police, there'll be a shootout. And then innocent people will get killed. You might not get him anyway. If you send a police party up from Hazelton to Kisfioks, there might be real trouble and some innocent people hurt. So he told Reverend Lee to go back and try and persuade him to surrender, but not to betray him. So that was and he had a chat with Gunanoot in the evening. Gunanoot almost surrendered, but then and he came in with 3 guns in his belt, and so he was prepared for trouble. He almost surrendered, but in fact his companion persuaded him not to, so he didn't. But that was one of the closest calls that I think Gunanoot had to being captured. And I think that many people knew he would never be caught out in the countryside. He'd only be caught if someone wanted the reward. There was a substantial reward offered for him, which was never claimed. Someone wanted the reward.
It's fascinating. And we have, hang on, we've got another question. You thank Neil J. Sturridge, I hope I'm saying that last name correctly, in your acknowledgements. Who is this? How did you connect with him? And what was the inspiration and encouragement that he gave you for this book? That's coming from Peter.
Neil Sturridge was a great, good friend. I say that because he was very supportive of my writing of the book about Dr. Rinch, and also about Pinkertons and Simon Gunanoot. He is the Sturridge name is a famous name in Hazelton, and there are many connections of the Sturridge to Hazelton, even now and then. And he was very supportive of me, and he encouraged me to write this book.
Curious if does anybody else have any questions that they want to post for us, as we have, looks like we've got like 8 minutes or so left in this awesome hour. Otherwise, I'll come back to my questions. You mentioned a bit about how, like, culturally it was obviously a different time, and there's lots of different references to the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I'm curious, just given kind of what the context looks like today, and thinking about the historical context, are there any interesting things that you've been thinking about as you wrote this, and just thinking about that time in history and our time now?
The past is a foreign country, as they say. They were very different times. And 1900 was a turning point. And I think some missed opportunities were taken at that time. Now, I'm not an expert in Indigenous relationships and Indigenous matters, so I have to make that caveat. And I think that up to 1900, there was a fairly good relationship. There were problems, sure, but people got on. There's a lot of intermarriage. There were a lot of mixed race families. A lot of the people, the white people there, spoke Indigenous languages, and they knew the customs, and they observed the rules and the laws. People got on, and it seemed to work. After 1900, as the colonial authorities and the modern world reached out, I think things started going awry. The railways arrived in 1913. The first automobile really arrived in 1920. from the south, although there was a famous arrival in about 1910, but it only got there because there's a big race, a big challenge for the first automobile to reach Hazelton from Vancouver or Seattle, and the car set out from Seattle. Great hurrahs and celebrations, and it arrived finally in Hazelton and won the prize. And there was a big medal awarded and many photographs taken and a big banquet held. Unfortunately, the car was taken apart over the most difficult part of the road, so it didn't actually get there on its own. I think the first car to actually get there on its own was about 1920, thereabouts. But roads came, people came, settlers came. A lot of settlers came who didn't understand Indigenous matters, didn't understand the need to get on, and that started sending things awry.
So you talk about the car, which is in your first book. That's why I'm smiling so much. So anybody that hasn't read Geoff's first book, Service on the Skeena, definitely should. And Bob and Linda, and I'm sure everybody else is wondering, topic of the next book? Can you give us a little sneak peek before we hop on?
I'm so glad you asked. I have another book coming out in the fall, and it's about murders in and around Hazelton between 1884 and 1914, and of which there are quite a lot, surprisingly. There's about a dozen murders in the book, and several murders I didn't put in the book. But one of the murders is of a man in 1884 who brought a canoe upriver, and a Giksan helper drowned. And he did not announce the fact when he arrived in Hazelton. And that really annoyed people. His only chance of saving himself was to tell people, the First Nations people there, what had happened and to make some reparation. He didn't. And because of that, he was murdered or killed. Question is, what you do with his murderer. There's no doubt what happened. A man came up to him with a knife as he stood on his porch and killed him. Should Indigenous law apply, by which it is lawful retaliation, or should colonial law apply, in which case he would be taken and hanged? So that's one of the chapters. And then there's another murder happened in 1898, where two prospectors in the Almanica Goldfields to the east of Hazelton, two went in, one came out, and everyone suspected that he had killed him, murdered him. He arrived in Hazelton under a cloud of suspicion, but no body, no charge of murder, and they couldn't find the body. So there's about 3 or 4 weeks in Hazelton where they were trying to find the body of this man. They couldn't arrest him because there's no crime had been committed. But then they'd found he'd stolen some, or had in his possession, some of the man's personal effects. And so they charged him for stealing. Taken to Victoria, basically put away for a year and a half while they looked for the body. They couldn't find it. He had to be let go. So there's quite a few interesting murders in Hazelton during these years. So the next book is a rather fun book about a dozen of these murders.
Well, I'm kind of hopeful. Well, I am hopeful that the next book launch can be in person, and that maybe you can read a little bit of these. These sound like stories that you should tell around a campfire or something, and scare all of us just a little bit about all these murders that happened.
Hazelton was a great place. It's one of the great places in the province, as far as I'm concerned. It's got so much history. It was a town before Vancouver was. There's great people living there, living there, and it's a beautiful setting where the two rivers come together. It's a great place. I love going there.
I'm not sure if it's 8 o'clock now. I'm wondering if Malika is going to come back on and send us all away. But if not, there's another question on here.
Sure, we can ask. We can go for the last question, and then I'll wrap things up. Nothing like talk of missing bodies to set the stage for the next event and get us all a bit spooked before we leave and all of that.
It's good. It's good suspense. We have to wait, but we can read Simon Gunanoot.
Not very long. The book's finished, so you just got to wait till the fall.
So there's one more question here from Duncan. It says, did you meet any of Simon's descendants in preparing for this book? And have they given you any feedback on your research?
The answer is no. And the reason is I'm very much a documentary historian. I really wanted to go into the documents and the papers, the contemporary documents and the papers, and not be drawn away by the many different accounts written since then. I mean, the book by David Williams is actually a very good book, and it's really on point. But I wanted to get into the newspapers. I wanted to get into the letters written by the policemen. I wanted to get into the reports written by the Gunanoot people. I wanted to really get into the original evidence, because that's where you see what is happening at the time without all the distortions of the last 100 years. So now I wanted to stick to the evidence available at the time.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Geoff, and thank you so much, Crystal. Someone put in the comments that we have people joining from Ontario, Alberta, Australia, London, England, and even Uganda. So this has truly been a global event. So congratulations, Geoff, on your global event.
Thank you very much.
A reminder that if you haven't already bought the book, you can just click on the green button at the bottom of the screen, and then, yes, thank you, Crystal, buy the beautiful book, and be on the lookout in the fall for Geoff's next book. And I know that signed copies are going really quickly at a book warehouse. So if you try and buy it and it's gone, you can also order the book directly from Caitlin Press or from your local bookstore. So thank you so much, everybody. And I hope that you found that as fascinating as I did. I think I can speak for everybody when I say that, you kept us on the edge of our seats and can't wait for the next one. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Geoff. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.
I'm going to hide you everywhere else.
Bye.